Hello, Internet. This is Wednesday's Serial. I'm here to talk about the whole Zuda Wildstorm thing in case you haven't heard about it yet. For those of you who haven't heard, DC made a big announcement in which they said Zuda would be basically closing by the end of this week, roughly, and then also Wildstorm would stop publishing as of December. And this has caused a lot of uproar, and besides them not publishing these things, 200 some employees under these imprints have lost their jobs, which is sad, though it should be pointed out that for the most part creators are unaffected because they're not employees, they're freelance despite the fact whether they're signed on or not most of the time. There's exceptions, but especially for things at this level that tends to be the case. So I read. This was from an affiliated source, and I can't verify that, but for the most part that rings true. What's also interesting about this is the fact that essentially they're closing down 2 imprints, which is a big deal. I want to begin with discussing Zuda, which was their online bit where creators would submit online, and a lot of these comics won various awards. Some not so much, but it was a fairly free amount of content, which was good, and it was interesting, so I heard. And this was the main failing of Zuda in my mind, is every time I saw it advertised, they went on about 1,000+ titles that you could read, which, even to someone like me who loves reading a number of comics, including online comics, it just seemed like a daunting task to try to dive in. They never seemed to pick specific titles, be like, check this out, and trying to sell you on different things to sell you on product rather than this imprint, which to me is always a failing, trying to sell a label rather than a story when what you're trying to do when you sit down and read a comic is ingest a story with good art. Now, what's doubly interesting about this is they had a great chance to pull online content in, potentially. There's some inner workings that I'm sure is written down nowhere, but imprinted under Wildstorm, which itself was, as I discussed, a DC imprint, was CMX, which was DC's manga line, which was shut down earlier this year on May 18th of 2010, so very recently. CMX was shut down under the idea that manga was struggling in America's marketplace right now, which is honestly bullocks. The main problem with CMX is really simple. They didn't have many core titles. They didn't have any content to really bring readers to the line. Now, that's not completely true. The one thing that they bought was Mega Tokyo, which has been stated will continue just under DC and not under CMX or Wildstorm or any of that, obviously. And what's also interesting about that in respect to Zuda is the fact that Mega Tokyo is an online comic, and it seems that there should be some way for them to just have the Mega Tokyo site be all interlinked in, as he's technically one of their creators now, but I guess nothing has ever worked out for that. There might have been some tricky legal reasons, but it does seem interesting. But it does go to the fact that the main comic in the manga comic line, which is supposed to be importing over Japanese comics, was an American created story, just happened to be based in Japan and focused in some ways around Japanese culture, though more of a merging of American and Japanese culture. To be fair to the Zuda comic situation, it was announced that Zuda would be ending after DC is planning to go forward with their own DC publishing content online, which was announced in response to Marvel's digital online, which is something they've been slowly building to. I know there's some stuff on, say, the PlayStation Network, but I think they're gearing up to go full bore, and it could be that they just wanted new staff to work on that, or I obviously know nothing about it, but I have a theory that in place of doing Zuda, they want to do something to include older comics to try to get a bigger online basis, and there's a good chance that the older Zuda content would be a big part of starting off with a large library. Then there's Wildstorm, which to me is a lot more of an interesting case with a few more layers that talk to some of DC's failings when it comes to some of their B, or if you consider it C-list characters. Now, the first interesting thing is that it said that all publishing of Wildstorm titles would stop as of December. However, there is a plan to publish a couple of trades in January, then also the Gears of War book number 2 in February, which extends past their line, and it's already on their website. Now, they could just mean new material by Comic Stop in December, and then they'll let the trades go on, because that's effectively just the price of publishing and content that's already been created. Maybe that's what they meant, however, interesting wording there. Now, one of the most interesting things about the Wildstorm issue comes under this quote from the press release by Dan Dido. While these will be the final issues published under the Wildstorm imprint, it will not be the last we see of many of these heroes. We, along with Geoff Johns, have a lot of exciting plans for these amazing characters, so stay tuned. Now, the first weird part about that is the fact that he needs to separate Geoff Johns from everyone else, despite the fact that it's DC higher-ups, and now Geoff Johns is not just a creator, but part of the staff. Okay, but the fact that he even brings his name in is odd without saying that he'd be writing or something. That's just awkward. Something Warren Ellis pointed out is while they're claiming that they'll bring some of the Wildstorm characters to the DC universe in one fashion or another, they made the same claim about the Milestone characters a while back. So, while the Milestone characters have been forgotten about, there's a good chance these Wildstorm characters could be forgotten about as well, which is a big concern for a lot of people who love these characters. And whereas I do understand that, I will say that the only Milestone character that I think has any real level of visibility is Static Shock, which even then is really under the weather, and perhaps he's been absorbed somewhere else in DC, or maybe there's some plans and it just hasn't come around yet. I have a feeling that the Authority and some of the bigger characters in Wildcats and Mr. Majestic could really stand a good chance of getting their own titles, because those were the few books that sold, and whereas 3 or so titles isn't enough to hold up an imprint, it's enough to keep them going, which is part of the reason that those characters stuck around in the first place. The Wildcats especially, because they've bounced around from imprint to label to imprint before, because that book sold well, but they were trying to hold on to a whole nother angle of a shared universe or whatnot, and they couldn't support that, but they could always support their own book. So I think it would be fair to say that a new Wildcats book could emerge, because at the end of the day, the sales figures need to be there in order to publish a mainstream book. Also, to that end, I've heard some concern among the Twitterverse about people being glad that they got the Authority books when they did recently or whatnot, or Wildcats or what have you. And I am one of those people who bought a slew of the Authority and Wildcats within the past year and ran through them all and loved the old stuff. And first, I will say that as long as the trades are selling, even if they just take off the Wildstorm imprint, as long as they're selling, DC will keep printing them, because they don't really have to pay creator costs, maybe then some small residuals, and they like making money, so as long as it makes money, they'll keep printing it. I can't back up that claim with anything other than the sheer logic of the fact that DC likes making money. Okay. Also is the fact that by reading the Authority and Wildcats through, I have to say, as they've been on the Wildstorm imprint, especially in the past year, the quality of the books and what made the books interesting and fun to read just dropped, which is why instead of picking up where I could have been starting from, I just had the comics I read, saw that it was going shit, and didn't read any more. And I know that I was not the only one, because I looked at sales figures at the time and saw severe plummeting of the titles and their sales around the time that I felt the quality plummeted as well. And it's kind of nice to see that reflected in sales figures for once, where you see a drop in quality and people just stop buying the book. Admittedly, it did take about 2 months for that to happen, which makes sense because a lot of comic shops, and when a lot of people order comics, have to order 2 months in ahead because of the way previews and Diamond work. Just to put that out there. So, the end point that I really want to make here is simple. A lot of people have been blaming the economy and bad business practices, and whereas I will agree with bad business practices, I think this is a good chance. And whereas DC is slimming down, it's a good chance for something new to crop up. A, for DC in the digital realm and maybe streamlining some Wildstorm stuff, sure. But the bigger thing here is whatever budget lost for some other Wildstorm titles could be funds where people go out and try an independent comic, and those kinds of sales will make a big difference in the independent comic market, bringing around new ideas, allowing creators to have a little more risk to where they can try a title and will make enough sales to where it was worth at least doing a 4-issue mini. And that in turn would allow the medium of comics to grow and not be so straddled, at least in America, with this superhero subgenre, but allow it to flourish to a fuller understanding, which, once it hits a certain level, if it's able to continue that, would draw in a whole slew of new readers, because you'd have more than just the people who are, say, the people who love Vertigo comics and nothing else, but a chance for people who really love hardcore sci-fi or fantasy or romance or what have you, to have multiple titles to come into and not be down to where, if they're really into it, maybe there's a comic they can buy. And I think that's a good chance for new readers to come in. Also, to the point of Zuda, it might allow some people who are reading Zuda to go check out a lot of independent comic creators who are doing all that stuff I was just talking about, but online, and go and read some great titles that are done by people who are invigorated by nothing more than just keeping their site going. And there's lots of great examples, more than I could even start to list. But if you're really looking for some different comics, just hop online. There's tons out there, and every time you view, the ad revenue will help support that artist for hopefully at least another day. I mean, there's lots of great stuff out there, and it just needs to be checked out, and I'm hoping this creates a big push so that comics designed to be online actually have a chance to get a little more support and recognition, because it's coming up, and there's some titles that have definitely made it, but it would be nice to see more than just video game humor and then a few choice titles here and there, but see a bigger swell of online comics get a lot more recognition. So, phew, you made it through the whole thing. Congratulations. And hopefully soon I won't hit you with a comic review, but something else that I was actually planning on doing today, but then this news caused this video instead. So, check you later. Oh, and if you like this video, click the like button. Feel free to subscribe, comment, anything. I could use some support.